531.
Oxfam Aotearoa, along with Oxfam Australia and Oxfam in the Pacific, have released a new report titled Breaking Through Red Lines. Oxfam says that the report draws attention to gaps in the latest funds announced for overseas climate action by the New Zealand government. The funds will go towards supporting efforts to reducing emissions in the Pacific. Oxfam in the Pacific's climate justice lead, Elizabeth Masivesi, says that while funds to support community adaptation and mitigation are crucial, the report shows that climate change is causing unavoidable loss and damage, which needs distinct funds to help communities recover and restore what has been lost. Oxfam in the Pacific's climate justice lead, Elizabeth Masivesi, joins us now from Fiji for more. Nisa Yandra Vinaka, and thank you for your time this afternoon, Elizabeth.
Yandra Vinaka, Brian, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Firstly, Elizabeth, an overview of the Breaking Through Red Lines report.
Vinaka, Brian, what the report is, three key things that is coming out really clearly on this report. Firstly, New Zealand's position does not align with Pacific Island countries' policy position. So at the upcoming COP26, making progress to mobilize sufficient funds to address loss and damage requires political will, as well as new and innovative sources of financing. Secondly, the report also highlighted that although New Zealand and Australia have contributed funds to set up insurance schemes to support Pacific Island communities to recover from cyclones, extreme weather, to maintain these, we need to rely on payments from affected communities and on the private market to make a profit. Very little has been done to help communities cover the cost of slow onset events like sea level rise, and what has been done is treated as adaptation. It's not really loss and damage finance. And also the report shows that loss and damage is being experienced by our Maori communities within Aotearoa, and that this needs a distinct response from the New Zealand government to uphold the Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
Elizabeth, examples of loss and damage across the Pacific currently as a result of impacts from climate change.
Some of the great examples that we could come up with, particularly when we talk about what's happening here in Fiji. Now, climate change is having a worrying implication on Fiji's food security. For instance, in places like Totoya in the Lau group here in Fiji, coastal erosion and flooding, they have resulted in a rapidly decreasing land available to grow crops, and this has led to lower crop yields. Secondly, we are also seeing incredibly destructive weather patterns, particularly very intense tropical cyclones. For example, the 2016 tropical cyclone Winston that hit Fiji, making it the strongest storm to make landfall in the southern hemisphere, Brian.
Elizabeth, so most pressing needs in addressing impacts of climate change in the Pacific as per Oxfam in regards to the report.
So the pressing needs, we need equitable, transparent, and accountable climate financing, Brian. Secondly, we need wealthy nations to decrease the use of loans as an instrument of climate finance and instead scale up grants or private sector financing. And also, Brian, we also, given the Pacific Island countries are at the forefront of the impacts of climate change, we need an urgent increase in financing for adaptation. As it is, however, a greater proportion of climate finance is focused on mitigation. Now, Australia and New Zealand, they have thankfully strayed away from that trend. However, we need them to also show exemplary behavior in terms of loss and damage financing and advocating for standalone loss and damage financing that is separate from mitigation and adaptation financing.
So you're saying with regards to New Zealand and Australia government, yes, they are helping, but more needs to be done from them, especially being the older siblings of the Pacific, as it were?
Definitely, Brian. Just recently, we heard that the New Zealand government committed the $1.3 billion to climate change in the Pacific. That's fundamentally very good news. And it's a long time coming, given that New Zealand's previous contributions were amongst the lowest in the developed world. Now, these funds, they will go primarily to support communities on the front line of climate change, for them to be able to adapt, such as securing fresh water supply in Pacific low-lying atolls. Another example would be to help farmers grow crops that are resilient to more extreme and frequent cyclones. Now, some of it will also go to support developing countries to reduce their emissions through building clean energy and transport and so forth. Now, however, there is a major gap where New Zealand's climate finance response is not addressing the needs expressed by those impacted. And that gap is compensating for the permanent loss and damage that is being brought about by climate change. Now, despite that effort to adapt, there are permanent and devastating impacts that climate change is having across the Pacific, including in Aotearoa. Now, these unavoidable impacts are what is called loss and damage, and that's where we need the Australian and the New Zealand government to commit to.
COP26 kicks off this weekend in Scotland, and there's so many governments and organisations going to be represented. What does Oxfam want to see in the way of a change or a redress from the governments attending this week?
Brian, thank you. There are 5 changes that I would like to say here. Firstly, Oxfam wants to see governments, particularly from wealthy nations, including New Zealand and Australia, to commit to the $100 billion pledge that they have still yet to meet. Secondly, Oxfam stands by the Pacific in calling for at least 50% of that climate finance to be spent on adaptation. In other words, helping countries become more resilient and they adapt to the dangerous effects of climate change, rather than just reducing their emission. Thirdly, Brian, Oxfam also wants government of wealthy nations to recognize that climate impacts are increasingly exceeding adaptive limits, meaning we cannot simply just adapt our ways to solutions, but we need to be serious about protecting the rights and the interests of frontline communities who suffer major food, property, life, and livelihood losses and have to uproot their homes due to the severity of climate impacts. Fourthly, related to the issue of loss and damage, we also want these governments to commit to supporting migration with dignity by prioritizing frontline communities' needs, their rights, and their interest in migration-related decisions, as well as promoting coherence between the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, and the climate dimensions of the global impact on migration. And finally, Brian, we also want them to commit to the operationalization of the Santiago network to provide the much-needed technical assistance to developing countries, and that's particularly for loss and damage.
At COP26, how many of our Pacific Island nations will be represented on the global stage, and to be able to voice the concerns of the people of the Moana, Elizabeth, as far as you're aware?
That is, I do not have that the data with me, Brian, but I know that there is over 30 representatives from Fiji that is in there. We're also looking at the pandemic, and I think it's a national call by each Pacific Island countries on the delegation that they are sending to Glasgow.
What can we, as people of the Moana, as people of the Pacific, do with regards to this pressing issue of climate change? And Elizabeth, where can people read the Breaking Through Red Lines report in full?
So our friends, our colleagues, our whanau, our Vuvale in the Pacific, they are facing intensifying threats to all aspects of life, culture, and security due to climate destruction, Brian. We are part of the Pacific family, or the Pacific Vuvale, or the whanau that we have. As Pacific Islanders, we are custodians of our resources. And as custodians of our resources, we need to hold our island homes and the Pacific oceans that surround them in trust for our future generations. Just as our ancestors ancestors have done for generations before us. So let me emphasize that the climate breakdown has mainly been caused by wealthier countries like New Zealand. And it is our own families in the Pacific that are suffering the consequences of these actions right now. So supporting our Pacific family is the right thing to do. For example, in Vanuatu, Vanuatu is classified as the most at-risk country on earth to natural disasters. In the last 5 years, it has endured 2 major volcanic eruptions and 2 Category 5 cyclones, which are becoming more intense due to climate change. Now, through a pioneering cash transfer program that uses blockchain, Oxfam has been able to provide quick and targeted cash support to households that are worst hit by the twin disasters of tropical cyclones and now with the COVID-19 pandemic, Brian. Now, in terms of the report, I can send you the link, Brian, and you could also have it put up on Facebook that our colleagues could access to, as well as for listeners, they can head on to oxfam.org.nz and just search loss and damage, and you will find the report, and they could read it from there.
Climate Justice Lead for Oxfam in the Pacific, Elizabeth Masivesi Vinaka Vakalevu. Thank you so much for your time today and really appreciate it. Take care.
Vinaka Vakalevu, Brian. Vinaka.